Welcome back to the Hardware Unboxed podcast for episode 63. As you might have guessed, this is a mega podcast episode recapping all the latest developments with the Radeon RX 9070 XT, the 9070 non-XT, and of course the RTX 5070 from NVIDIA as well. So we're going to be talking about the pricing and supply situation that we've seen, the sales and everything over the last couple of days, just the value proposition, AMD making choices about the launch, features, the GeForce GPU, the 5070 not being particularly great, and the complications around that. So lots and lots of discussion in this one about GPUs. So let's get into it. Well, Steve, we've got a massive episode this week. This could be the longest Hardware Unboxed podcast episode ever. Not sure, but we've got a lot of GPUs to talk about. There's been 3 launches, pricing discussion, FSR, other features, so many things to get into. But I just want to say a quick shout out to all the people that have just been watching our videos over the last couple of days, all the people that have, been really engaged in the reviews, the FSR coverage. It's been really great. So, appreciate everyone that's sort of jumping back into the PC ecosystem, because I feel like over the last couple of years, people have sort of, lost a bit of interest as GPUs have been bad, but now that there's some exciting stuff, people are coming back. So that's great. So shout out to all the people that have been watching our videos. But how you doing, Steve? We're on the other end of the GPU stuff for at least the moment. How are you feeling?
Yeah, funny that you sort of say that. When you messaged me not that long ago to say, hey, we do the podcast today, I was like, it's Monday. Today is Monday. Yep. So that's how I'm doing. I can't say I've recovered or come up for air just yet, because, I've spent my entire weekend frantically trying to update results for my 9950 X3D review, which will be dropping tomorrow night. So the night after the podcast goes live, but it'll be one of those like 1 a.m. releases for us. Balin and I might do a stream or something beforehand, because they seem to be pretty popular at the moment. We're having a lot of fun doing it, and the guys keep asking me when I'm going to stream again and why don't I stream more and stuff. And the answer is kind of time and energy. If I had more of it, then I would do more of it. But just fitting in stuff like the podcast and that was kind of scrambling to get all these things done. So the last week was insane. I barely slept for some reason. Balin and I did 2 massive streams as well in a really busy week. So probably not the wisest of choices, but we had a lot of fun doing it. So I guess you got to have some fun along the way, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. And, it seems like you're basically getting, at least by the sounds of some rumors, pretty much no break, because we've obviously got like the RTX 5060 series. Apparently there's a 5050 as well coming. And then obviously AMD's got some other GPUs as well, which we're probably not even going to have time to get into any of that in this podcast. We'll just be sticking to the stuff that's just launched. But down the track, you'll be flat out covering all that stuff as well. And obviously there's still a lot of other investigations with just the GPUs that have been launched so far to get into. So lots of exciting stuff. But at least it's, it's busy, but we've been covering stuff that's at least somewhat interesting. Like I know the 5070 is a bit of a dud, and the 9070 non-XT is a bit of a dud as well. But, at least when we're covering things like the 9070 XT, and we're going to be talking about pricing in a video probably this week, and FSR and all those sorts of things, it's at least, interesting to talk about those sort of things.
There's something there for sure.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to start with just talking about maybe the supply of the GPUs, because I feel like a lot of people probably know what the performance is and all that sort of thing. They've probably watched the reviews. So I think the main thing that we really haven't talked about, and it was funny, I was looking at the FSR4 video comments just after that video went live, and it was just hours upon hours of people commenting, aren't you guys going to talk about the pricing, the supply of the GPUs? Why can't I buy one? All that sort of thing. So that's probably where we should start, the 9070 XT. Obviously, it's been a successful product. In most regions, it is basically sold out, even at the higher than MSRP prices. Here in Australia, we've heard about, obviously, there's tons of supply of this model and the 9070 as well, just loads more than usual for a release. But even then, it's sold out. But obviously, people have been a bit suspicious and complaining about the prices of some of those models. So what have you heard? What's going on, Steve? Why the prices so high?
Yeah, look, I think at this point we're in the inevitable phase, right?
Yeah.
This was always going to take place. Things were always going to go the way they have. The question now is, what does the situation look like in 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks from now? Does it continually improve as supply starts to catch up with demand? I hope and I think we'll see that with the Radeon GPUs. Why we haven't seen that with the GeForce GPUs? Yeah, interesting. It seems like some of our speculation and theory about that probably wrong, because I can't really explain. I think the speculation that we made a few podcasts ago about them, the market manipulation, deliberately limiting supply of stuff like 5090s and that to keep prices high. I don't know whether we're right or wrong about that, but that really shouldn't, I wouldn't have thought, apply to the 5070 series, especially once AMD has competition. We thought they'd turn on the tap, so to speak, and that hasn't happened, at least so far. And it seems like there are some manufacturing issues or some sort of issue there for NVIDIA that are stopping them from supplying anywhere near the amount of product they need to. Whereas that,
especially with the 5070, right? Because the Founders Edition card's not going to be available for a couple of weeks, even though obviously you tested it for the 5070 non-TI, of course, we're talking about. I don't know how quickly we expected them to turn on the tap for that sort of thing. I would have thought maybe a couple of weeks. But if we're getting to the end of March and these cards still aren't available, the GeForce GPUs, then I think it's safe to say that our speculation based on those models is wrong. So that's at least where we're at the moment.
Yeah, and to be clear, at the time we said this is like a almost conspiracy theory type thing. Like, it was pure speculation. We had no idea, and it seemed like no one else had any idea as to what the real answer was or what was going on there. So we made up a couple of theories as to what could be going on. And yeah, still not clear on that one. But as for the Radeon GPUs, what we do, I guess the facts we do have at hand is the fact that to date, there has been virtually no GeForce 50 series stock. And quite oddly, you would expect the 5070 series to have appeared in larger numbers initially. You'd think, okay, 5090s, probably not going to be as many of those. There'll be more 5080s and so on and so forth. Like, the further you go down the GeForce food chain, the more abundant the supply becomes. But that hasn't been the case. It seems like there was probably the most 5080s of the series, and then for some reason just no 5070s. So that's weird. But the I guess, yeah, the fact is there's been little to no supply of GeForce GPUs, whereas with the RDNA 4, the Radeon 9000 series, supply has been really good. Some retailers have had more than 1,000 cards, for example, for the day one sales. Some of that shouldn't be terribly surprising, given that they were meant to be released in January, so they've essentially just been stockpiling them for a few months. But at the same time, the GeForce GPUs have been available technically since then, and we haven't seen anywhere near that kind of resupply that would match what we've seen on the Radeon side. So there are just way more Radeon GPUs available for purchase and now out in the wild than there are current generation GeForce GPUs. Why that is, I don't know. It's odd. We haven't really seen a situation like this, but yeah, I spoke with a few different retailers, major retailers, not just in Australia, but a few different sources, and they all told me the same thing. They have thousands, or at least more than 1,000 9070 series. It's in some cases just 9070 XT graphics cards. And if they are able to sell all of those, they will have sold more Radeon GPUs than all GeForce 50 series GPUs combined. And that certainly seems to be the situation. And we're seeing AMD even clawing back some market share purely because they have product to sell and the competition doesn't. And it's not like people can buy other GeForce GPUs. There's really no GeForce GPUs to buy.
There's no GPUs at all. Like, all of the previous generation models have been discontinued by this point. And like I said in the previous podcast, I think that's because they were planning for a launch a little earlier than they were planning for. So this kind of created a supply shortage because they were expecting to launch models probably late last year or at the very least January of this year,
Mhm.
push back the launch by a couple of months. No supply for those cards for that time. You're going to get some pent-up demand for GPUs. So if you can't buy GeForce 50 series, you can't buy any previous model, and the cards that are available are the 9070 XT,
Mhm.
then yeah, there's going to be a lot of demand. And even for some of those high-priced models, it looks like they've been selling relatively well because of that. In addition to obviously there just being thousands of models, so lots of people have been interested. The cards are good, so that improves the perception of the models. People actually want to buy them, so all that's been sort of a nice situation for AMD. Really, they've been able to capitalize on that quite well. So people have been buying them. There's been models that's been good.
Yeah, well, people are worried about missing out. And that's why those stupid expensive models that really shouldn't be selling have been selling, because people have no confidence that in a couple of weeks from now, supply will be meeting the demand. But I think in the case of the Radeon GPUs, I think we will see that. Of course, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but based on everything I'm hearing, the information that I do have, it seems very much like it'll be a situation where you better buy Radeon GPUs, at least in like a month or two from now. You'll be able to buy them, and they'll be closer to the MSRP. Prices will settle down. What's going to happen with the GeForce GPUs? I couldn't even guess at this point, because I don't really understand what's going on there, and I can't really get any information from anyone else who seems to know what's going on there. It's a very odd situation. But yeah, I think they're going to keep making these 9070 XTs and 9070s, for example, and the pricing will obviously come down when the demand slows. That's just how supply and demand works, and they're not going to stop making them or whatever. Like they'll be flooding the market as best they can with them, you would think.
Yeah, and I think with this particular launch, there's some other reasons why that's also likely to happen, and why we're probably not going to see as much of the inflated pricing stuff that we're seeing at the moment. And that's because with this launch, it's kind of weird, because it's not usual that a retailer would be getting huge stock or huge supply of these models months in advance. So for a lot of retailers, 9070 XTs and 9070s have been sitting in their warehouse since January, or even in some cases we've heard earlier than that. So as early as December of last year. I think Gamers Nexus was saying they've spoken to people, and they were saying as early as December, which is crazy. Like if you're talking about a product launching in March, and then the GPUs have been sitting in warehouses since January, that creates some issues for retailers. So retailers don't get the cards for free. It's not like they're supplied and then they have to pay later for the models once the GPUs start being sold after the March release. They pay for the models up front, which is just, this is obvious, right? Retailers buy stock, they have to pay for it. The issue with this, though, is that retailers and AIBs and everyone involved in the chain didn't actually know the price of these cards ahead of the launch. So what we were hearing pre-launch, pre-announcement of the MSRP was pretty concerning from retailers. They were telling us that the prices that they were effectively paying to get these cards in was quite high. And so that was causing some, a bit of concern from the retailers, thinking, we've stockpiled all these models. Are we going to be able to sell them at that price that we've been paying for them? Because we kind of feel like the price is a bit too high.
Yeah, I'll just jump. It's quite a complicated process. I don't know exactly how it works and what the percentages are, but my understanding is they don't pay the full price up front. They pay a agreed upon price, and then if they adjust the price or whatever, there can be rebates or whatever. But I don't believe they buy the card for like $750 and then sell it for the 10 or 20% markup or whatever. It's a lower fee, and it's all worked out once the sales occur and all that sort of stuff. And so it's I think it's quite complicated and messy, at least for some of the bigger guys that do large numbers. But yeah, anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I think my understanding was there was like they have to pay some number originally, but then if there's price corrections later, they then get a rebate from AMD, or it's not from the AI. Anyway, we'll probably get into that a bit more.
It's complicated, but varies.
Yeah, it's very complicated. But basically, retailers have to buy the cards before they know the price. And so there's the potential for the price to be that they've paid for the models, the effective price that they're expecting to be higher than the actual price that's announced. So this is, I think, why we saw a lot of these retailer leaks listing effectively placeholder prices that were $700, $800 US. It's because the price that they were paying on the back end, even with all the, potential percentages up front or whatever, they were expecting that for them to make a profit selling those cards without any rebates, that's the price that they would have had to sell the cards for. And so what then happens is they get all these cards in, they've got thousands ready to go. They wait for AMD to announce the price. And then when AMD announces the price, if that price is lower than the expected price that the retailers were having to pay, then there's a rebate system that occurs. So instead of the retailers going to the AIBs and going, well, we bought these cards for an expected price of, let's say, $700, but the MSRP is $600, so we want $100 back from the AIBs. My understanding is that it's more they get like a bulk sum of money from AMD directly. So they'll go, hey, you've got X number of cards in stock. We're going to give you X dollars of rebate, which will hopefully allow you to hit the MSRP on some cards. So this might be for a certain quantity of models, for some specific models. So that could be like, they'll be like, oh, okay, so you've got 1,000 Sapphire Pulse models. That's the model we want you to hit the MSRP for. So we'll give you however much money as a rebate. Or maybe the rebate will have some conditions attached. So it might be, we'll give you the rebate if you sell all of those models or whatever the case may be. So again, it's very complicated back-end deals going on. But effectively, at least what we heard around the launch was that potentially those rebates were only applied to some specific models and maybe more in some regions than others. At least here in Australia, there wasn't as much supply of the MSRP cards as you would have seen from like a Micro Center, where it sounded like if you attended one of those stores in person, there was a number of different MSRP models you could choose from and reasonable supply of the MSRP cards. Here in Australia, a little different, more limited supply of the MSRP cards. Maybe you'd only see one model, like a Power Color model at one retailer, maybe a Sapphire model at another retailer, but most of the cards being priced above. So eventually what we're working to here is that the reason why you might have seen higher pricing for a couple of weeks or at the moment after launch is because AMD's rebated a certain number of those models. So if you were lucky, you would have gotten a card that was rebated to $600, but potentially those rebates didn't cover all of the models. So retailers are still buying them maybe they paid $700 or $750 equivalent back in January, and that card didn't get rebated. Therefore, they have to sell it for $700 or $750 or whatever. That is all a bit of a mess because we're talking about buying cards well before the prices are available. For a lot of launches, it's much more straightforward. They know the price ahead of time. They buy the cards in. There's no rebate system that's necessary. What's potentially going to happen from now on is that they can reset all that pricing stuff. So the retailers don't have to buy the cards for $700 and get a rebate. Everyone in the supply chain just knows it's a $600 card, so all the prices are set to that. That's at least the theory of how it should work from now on, and that's why I think we're both somewhat confident that will happen, is that the new supply that they're getting in, they'll be buying that for lower and lower prices over time as the prices reset and things like that. Obviously, there is some risk that, the AIBs or distributors or even retailers or AMD even, they get a little greedy and they go, well, these cards have been selling for $700, so we'll try maintain that for as long as possible. But at least there is a chance that as the market gets flooded and prices can reset and things, that you won't see these crazy like, oh, why am I buying a Power Color Red Devil for like 30% over the MSRP? Shouldn't that be more like 10 or 15% over? Probably yes, and probably that will happen in a couple of months. So at least that's my understanding of why you sort of saw what you saw, especially in Europe, where, it sounded like it was a little worse in Micro Center sort of deals. You had to really click the buy buttons pretty much straight away to get one. And then obviously the other models were higher priced. So it's just one of those things. It's a mess at launch, and we'll be keeping track of those sort of things to make sure that, when AMD says it's a $600 card, that you can buy one at $600 at some point. It doesn't become like a a B580, which is just not available for $250.
Yeah, it's sort of a dynamic situation because they can already say that's been achieved, just like NVIDIA can say that that's been achieved. And then they can say there's a couple of ways. There's two main ways, at least off the top of my head, that I can see them going about this, because AMD has been presented with a very unique situation that I can't imagine will reoccur anytime soon. I'm not exactly even sure what the situation is, as I've said. I just know there's a situation right now where there's GeForce GPUs are almost non-existent in the gaming market. The supply has been very bad, very weak. So that's unusual. So they can either capitalize on that in terms of margins and do what we sort of thought NVIDIA was doing and keep a steady but like a steady but managed supply of GPUs to keep prices high, and throw a bone here and there with a rebated MSRP model like a Pulse or whatever, just so the trackers are detecting the odd one or two of those sold every now and then. And then the rest of them are all the higher end, higher margin cards that they can just be like, well, it costs $800 because it's a Red Devil or whatever. That's how they could play it, which you were doing a business sense to maximize profits and make RDNA 4 look like a huge success because it's made this much money or whatever. I think that would be the wrong way of going about it, though. I think really what they want to do, which is what we've been calling for them to do generation after generation, and with this unique situation, is just pump out as many of these 9070 XT, 9070 series graphics cards or GPUs as they can. Just get them out there, essentially flood the market. If it means selling them at MSRP, so be it. And get as many people that were going to buy GeForce GPUs instead to buy Radeon GPUs. Hopefully, they should have a good experience with Radeon GPUs, and then they've started rebuilding the brand. That's how I think they should go about it, is just meet that demand as best they can rather than try and milk it.
Yeah, and I think doing your strategy as well, like the pricing kind of takes care of itself. Like if you start flooding the market, then eventually the pricing will settle and go down to the MSRP. So I don't think it's a situation where they can flood the market, but also flood it for like $700 or $800, because eventually you'll just use up the amount of people that are willing to pay that price. So yeah, if they keep just pumping out model after model after model, yeah, maybe for a couple of weeks to a couple of months, you will see, AIBs are going to be incentivized to make more Red Devils than entry-level models, or high-tier models than entry-level models in general, because that makes them more money. But eventually, standard supply and demand stuff, right? You flood the market with those models, then people, the sales of them slow down. So then you have to move to your next lower tier, eventually hit the MSRP. And that's generally how most graphics card launches have worked in the past. So yeah, it's not unusual that you can't just go buy a 9070 XT right now. Again, when cards are good and people want them, that has been the case for many launches in the past. It's making sure that in 6 months from now, the MSRP is the MSRP. It's not suddenly $700 or $800 for all models, which has happened for cards like a 2080 Ti, for example, which was supposed to be $1,000, but then 6 months later it was still $1,200. So yeah, with the 9070 XT, I feel like the strategy is make as many of them as possible. Because I think in that Gamers Nexus video he made pre-launch, he made a really good point, Steve from Gamers Nexus, about how AMD just needs customers. That's the thing that they need the most of. They don't need to make tons and tons of huge profits and capitalize on the short term. They need gamers willing to buy their cards. That's the number one thing. Get people to buy them. And so you make as many as you possibly can in situations where people want to buy them, which is right. People want to buy these cards right now. So make tons of them. And I think the pricing thing will take care of itself. If they limit supply, that just would be a really bizarre move for me. Like,
wouldn't shock me,
yeah.
But prioritizing profits, would not shock me if they do that. I really hope they don't, because they need to hit the market as hard as they possibly can to, do exactly what Gamers Nexus and really what we've been saying as well. And, convert as many gamers to Radeon owners as possible, because if they have a good experience with Radeon GPUs, they're probably more likely to stick with them moving forward. And they need to do that, right? That's what they've got to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the perfect storm for them. You couldn't have predicted that this would play out the way it has. Like, RDNA 4 was written off well before it was even announced, purely because AMD was changing strategy. They weren't attacking the high end. They were just going to be sort of mid to maybe high end-ish kind of GPUs. And it sounded almost like they'd given up on trying to compete. And now they're in a situation where they can really outcompete NVIDIA for this generation, at least at this point in time.
Well, I mean, right now they can certainly capitalize on the lack of supply, but even beyond that, they have a reasonable chance. Like they've been established into a good position to begin with, which is what they didn't do with the previous generation with all of their poor reception, poor reviews, that sort of thing. Obviously, GeForce GPUs were much more readily available, but this is something that you can, or at least AMD can, carry momentum through to the rest of the generation. So even after GeForce GPUs become more available at some point, they've at least started into this momentum where gamers are talking about AMD GPUs and Radeon GPUs, and people are talking more about the GeForce side of things of like, can you buy them? The prices are too high. And then all the issues on top of that, the missing ROP situation, the black screen issues with the drivers. And so it's just a night and day difference. Like, yes, I'm sure in 6 months you'll be able to buy a 9070 XT, a 5070 Ti, basically the prices that they've advertised at the MSRPs. But just the whole perception around those cards is going to be very different because of how the launches have begun. And it'll almost be like NVIDIA now needs to do the AMD thing of changing the perception after launch, like with the 7900 XT, for example, having to change the price after launch. Well, now it's NVIDIA that has to convince gamers that they're actually selling the cards for the price they've said and that all the issues and stuff are fixed and that you can actually buy them. So that'll be interesting.
Yep. Yeah, we've seen a lot of feedback that the MSRP doesn't matter, it's all a lie, so on and so forth. I get where that is coming from, but at the same time, people have bought these for the MSRP. And at least at this point in time, we believe that the MSRP will be something that you can just go out and buy an MSRP card, no worries, in the not too distant future. The situation, again, that we're seeing right now was inevitable. It was never playing out any other way than it has, unless reviews were absolutely terrible and the pricing was really bad, then the interest in the Radeon GPUs, probably. But when there's a market that needs to be serviced and no one's servicing it except you come in and you're like, well, I've got a thing, you're probably going to be able to sell it, right? People want GPUs, and you can't buy an older GeForce GPU. You can't buy a current generation one, at least brand new. So if AMD had supply, they were kind of going to win by default. But our concern was they can't afford to just win by default, because you don't want to capitalize on whatever this window is by just selling a subpar product because there's no alternative, and then as soon as the alternative turns up, you're dead. So I think they've done this well. They've got the positive reviews. People are obviously very excited about it. It's selling at slightly higher prices because of that, but it will eventually be a $600 product. And like, to be clear on our side, we're telling you, don't buy this product unless it's $600. Don't entertain a 5070 Ti unless it's $750. Don't buy above the MSRP. The MSRP will be a thing, or it should be a thing. And again, people have bought plenty of 9070 XTs. Like, it's not just like 4 or something like that. Like, hundreds, thousands of them have sold at the MSRP. And I'm very confident the MSRP will be a thing for these parts. So really, there's no other way I can put this than it is too soon to judge. So whether you think the MSRP is real, whether you think it's fake, doesn't matter. Point is, it's far too soon to make that call. So you could really make that call now on a part like a 5090, a 5080, probably 5070 Ti, 5070. They're pretty clear that what that situation is right now. I don't expect the MSRP of those products to improve in the next 4 weeks. They might. I don't expect that to be the situation. It sounds like this is going to be an ongoing thing for quite some time. But I do expect the Radeon GPUs to be available at MSRP and probably not too distant future. So, but again, it's just too early to call.
Yeah, I think the only real concerning thing was really just that rebate situation in terms of how many cards were getting rebated in various different markets, whether AMD rebated all models or some models. It sounded like they went down the some model path as opposed to the all model situation.
They're
So
absolutely playing the game there.
that is playing the game. That's doing what companies do to make profit. So it's unfortunate situation. Would like to see, you know, they're not to be models that are like $800 or listed at $700 when they should be closer to $600. But again, I think in the days, at least the last couple of days, it's becoming, you know, more likely that they're going down the we're trying to make this towards the MSRP path than the we're going to try this selective rebate system, which, you know, as we
It,
said, they could have gone either way with that. But
yeah, it's clearly a juggling act, right?
yeah,
They can make really good money right now. So it's hard to turn away a situation where you can make really good money right now, but they're also managing the perception of the brand and how much people care about Radeon GPUs. Because we've said this all, you can't judge the success of RDNA 4 right now. That would be foolish to do so. If the Radeon RX 9070 XT was a $700 US product, it would have been met with terrible reviews and it would have been met with terrible reception from enthusiasts, and it still would have sold basically as well as it has to this day. Beyond that, I think the story for the majority of the product's lifetime would be very different.
I think AMD at the end of the day has made the right choice to wait for the launch, because obviously they copped a fair bit of criticism for, you know, oh, why didn't they try to launch ahead of GeForce and do all these things to ensure that the cards are getting out there right now. I think the situation of waiting has played out very well for them. Because if I think about, like, let's go to like an alternate reality where they launched the model in January. Like, I think the original thinking
I know what you're going to say, but I just want to. They've got luck on their side in the sense that while I agree, what they've done is how they should have done it. It was the right move. It ended up with a situation where ultimately it just didn't matter. Even AMD couldn't have screwed this up, because if they had gone first with a too high a price, they would have been met with negative reviews, which would have screwed it up long term, which I think was where you're going with this. But they still would have sold anyway because they were the default / only choice.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think at launch they would have launched ahead of all of the GeForce cards. Wasn't that the original thinking?
Yeah, so
was like
mid-January? Yeah. So, okay, in this hypothetical, is the launch going to be the exact same launch, so $600, or are they going to do like an AMD thing, which we know they're going to do and be like $650, $700?
Well, I would think that what they probably would have done back in January is probably launch at a higher price, right? Because
sure, definitely. They were definitely doing that.
Everything we've heard is basically they were definitely going to do that. You would have heard the dubbed over audio in the launch video. So, wonder how close to launch they changed that price.
We can take a small bit of credit from helping AMD save themselves from being AMD there. Like, everyone who made a video, like, being AMD, look, we know what you want to do, but it's the wrong thing to do, and here's why. Like, we're going to lay out the AMD history for you because somehow you're unable to learn past lessons. So everyone who, like Gamers Nexus, everyone that made those kind of videos, in some way they've contributed to the success of RDNA 4, because AMD absolutely were going to screw this up. Like, this isn't even speculation on our behalf. Like, they were absolutely going to screw the price up. They were under the impression that somewhere in the $650 to $700 range was an excellent price for this product.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it would have gone even worse for them if they had launched that ahead of the 50 series, because I think a couple of things probably would have happened. Firstly, they launched first at a mediocre price. So let's say they targeted somewhere $650 to $700. Well, NVIDIA had already announced the 5070 Ti and 5070 at the prices they did. But at that time, we didn't know the GeForce 50 series performance. So obviously, now that we've seen the reviews, the performance is relatively underwhelming compared to prior generations. but I think people were expecting more from those cards in between the announcement and the actual performance reviews.
I still think it's the availability that's killed them more than anything. I
I
think people
think
still want to buy them,
I
believe it or
think
not.
I think so. Yeah, there's obviously always demand for GeForce cards. But I guess what I'm saying is that if Radeon tried to make a model for $700 and they went, this is our card for $650 to $700, people would have been comparing that to a mythical 5070 Ti that they had no idea what the availability was and no idea what the true performance of the card was. So people
Yep.
would have been expecting a much better situation. They would have been expecting you could buy one day one, a 5070 Ti, and that the performance was probably a little better than what it ended up being. So I think if the price was mediocre, people would have just waited for the GeForce model. So the payoff would have been potentially later because maybe, okay, the 5070 Ti comes out. It's clear that it's not as good as it was and there's no availability. So then people start buying 9070 XTs.
Yeah, yeah.
But potentially for that launch period, people would have been getting into this mindset of, that's, the comparisons would have been to like a 4070 Ti Super, for example. If it was $700, it's like $100 cheaper than that model. Oh, but then we have to factor in the 5070 Ti is coming at some point. We're not really sure what the performance is, but it's $750 theoretically. And, where's it going to lie in performance? I feel like a lot of people would have kind of dismissed the Radeon model if it was expensive, the uncertainty of the GeForce. Because at that point, we wouldn't have even known what the 5090 was like, what the 5090 supply would have been like. So we would have had really no hints of this at all. And I think it just would have flopped big time.
I definitely agree. Like that, I didn't mean it would be the same situation as in the 5070 Ti, 5070 would launch, supply would be terrible, and then AMD would sell 1,000 GPUs overnight at one retailer. I meant more that they were really they were going to succeed at least during this period, no matter what, to varying degrees. So I think the way they've played it is probably one of the more or I don't know if the most successful, but certainly one of the more successful ways of going about it. Whereas having released prior, which is the situation we're going with now, would have been one of the least optimized for capitalizing on this period. And then the Radeon brand essentially dies after however long this period is because it's all negative. It's the reviews would have been negative. The reception from enthusiasts would have been negative, and it would have been like, well, I'm just buying the Radeon GPU because essentially it's my only option. I need a GPU and there's nothing else. I'll just get one. So they would have sold them that way. But you want to sell them where people are genuinely excited and saying that these products are great. FSR4 is massively improved. There's all these, the features are improved. The performance is good for the price and so on and so forth. And that's how ultimately you end up with people that for some reason are spending more than $800 on a 9070 XT, which is pure insanity, but that is the market and the situation we're in right now. But yeah, obviously our advice is to wait at this point in time.
Yeah, of course. I mean, even when people are buying the cards at inflated price, and I think this is the point you made in your review, is, when you compare real versus real price, so long as the AMD GPU is a certain percentage cheaper than the 5070 Ti, then the AMD card can be a higher price and still be a good buy at that time in the market. I think that's what you see in regions like Australia, for example, where, the majority of 9070 XTs that you can buy are not really a $600 US equivalent price. Even the base models are more like $650 US, to sort of give you an idea. When you convert it to AUD, add tax, that sort of thing, comes out to more like $650. But then you look at the 5070 Ti, which, so I think over at PC Keski, they were selling the cheapest 9070 XTs were about 1,150 Australian dollars. The MSRP of the 5070 Ti is $1,500. So that's already more favorable to AMD than usual. But then the $1,500 AU MSRP was just, if you think like maybe a few people in the US bought one at that price, virtually zero people in Australia bought it at that price. So it was much more like $1,700, $1,800, if not more. Yeah, so I've just had a look. The majority of models that are even listed, they're all sold out, obviously. You know, it jumps up from $1,500 pretty quickly to $1,700. And then the models that are actually in stock, if you wanted to buy one right now, are $1,900 minimum at PCK Australian. The 9070 XTs, yeah, maybe most of them were available for around the $1,300 mark. $1,300 is way better than $1,900. So that's a significant percentage difference in favor of AMD and makes it so that, yeah, okay, both models are inflated, but still the Radeon model comes out looking reasonably good. And I think that's why the launch has been a success at the moment.
Yeah, looking at the typical prices at PCK Ski, you're saving about 22% by going with the Radeon GPU, which is, sort of a window that we felt acceptable. Of course, they're out of stock of everything at the moment on both sides, but they have sold considerably more 9070 XTs. Like,
yeah,
it's not even a comparison to be made, really. They will have sold that many more. That I would say they've sold more 9070 XTs than they have all GeForce 50 series GPUs to date. I'm pretty confident that would be the situation over there because they've again been stockpiling them for months now, and we know supply of them is good relative to what you get on the GeForce side of the fence.
Yeah, so that's really the thing that AMD just needs to keep on top of as these sort of things settle over the next couple of months, is just ensuring that if GeForce GPUs start to become available, that the pricing gap between NVIDIA and AMD is maintained similar to the MSRP. So if they're offering, I think you said about 15% better cost per frame in the review, but in terms of the actual price difference, the GeForce model is about 25% more expensive. So if they're maintaining that gap in real prices and eventually it sells down to MSRP versus MSRP at some point, I think that will be a reasonably successful launch in general from AMD. That would be a good position to be in. And then if they can do, as we're sort of suggesting, flood the market with models, get that price down to the MSRP while the NVIDIA prices are higher than $750 for the 5070 Ti and 5070 is higher than $550, then they'll win more and more and more, the more that they can achieve that, because people just will not be entertaining a GeForce. I don't think people would entertain these GeForce cards for a 30%, 35% higher price. I just don't think that's happening.
Not for that high. At the moment, we have no insight into that whatsoever. We really don't. Yeah. The reason Radeon GPUs have sold, at least to this point when they were in stock, is because they were in stock and there was no alternative. So, but again, people were willing to buy them even at slightly or reasonably high inflated prices, was because the reviews were good. Like, everything's checked. They've ticked all the boxes. Again, FSR4 has gotten a lot better. The ray tracing performance has improved to where it's usable, especially in games where it's mandatory at like Star Wars Outlaws, for example. So the performance overall is quite good, and the claimed price is quite good. So it's like green light there, go buy one. Oh, and you can actually go buy one, so I'll just do that. But when the market returns to normal, whatever that looks like, but let's just say you can buy a 5070 Ti for $750, or a 5070 for $550, and then you can buy the 9070 series for the MSRPs. So just say that was a situation, right? You could go buy any of those four products at the MSRP. That's when it's going to be really interesting to see how the sales data compares between GeForce and Radeon at those fixed prices. And I suspect in a market, in a world where that situation plays out, we will see discounts applied to the 9070 series to make them a bit more appealing and help them along a bit more. Because I think they will struggle. They'll certainly struggle considerably more than they are now. But I think sales will have slowed up to a point where AMD will be wanting to help them along, let's say. So you'll probably see like $50 knocked off the price or something like that. But again, well, that'll be something for us to discuss in, I don't know, podcast number 7. What are we on now? Actually, are we on 70 now?
We're at 63, I think. So
yeah, okay. No, I'll go with 70 then. Podcast 70. That'll be something for us to discuss, I reckon, thereabouts.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously there's going to be more GPUs launched as well, so they're going to have to start competing against products like a RTX 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte, which
Hmm.
I don't know how good that model's going to be. Obviously, we don't have it. We don't even have any announced information about it. But the 5070 is obviously a fairly underwhelming product. But there's going to be more pressure from people, from Nvidia launching lower price models over time, especially because that 16 gig model is probably going to avoid some of the VRAM complaints that the 8 gig model will get.
Yeah.
So we don't know what the price is, right? But that has the potential to be a model that casual PC gamers are quite interested in.
Hmm.
And so, while I think even at MSRP versus MSRP, if you were looking at like a 5070 for $550 or a 9070 XT for $600, I think, you know, you can make a reasonable case that the 9070 XT is the card that you would buy. Like just the 5070 is just not good.
You could,
So,
yeah, you could definitely make that argument.
and so,
Yeah.
you've made the case that the 9070 XT versus 5070 Ti, you can go either way. But with the 9070 XT versus 5070, I think there's certainly they've made a reasonable case there. But as lower cards start coming in, maybe there's a more attractive mid-range option. Then some of those pricing considerations would have to come into play. And I think if the cards were the 5070 and the 9070 XT were the exact same price, like what you were saying, if they drop the price by give a $50 discount in 6 months or whatever, I think the 5070 you'd have to really contort yourself to think of that
Well,
as the card that you would buy. Like,
yeah, the 5070 is a piece of crap. It was funny. I don't know if this is true, and it's I'm certainly not having a go at Gamers Nexus here, but I saw quite a few comments saying that and this is obviously AMD fan coping, if you will, saying that because my 9070 review, so the non-XT review, wasn't terribly positive, just because it's not really a bad product, just a dumb price. Like you just wouldn't
mhm.
buy it, right? I can't imagine a world where these cards are selling at MSRP and anyone would go, oh, I'm going to save $50 to get the non-XT. Like that's crazy talk. And the 5070 is obviously garbage. And I haven't watched the Gamers Nexus review, so I can't confirm whether this is true. And knowing the comprehension skills of people who make these comments, he probably made one remark about this and they took that as the entire conclusion. But essentially, they're claiming Gamers Nexus was saying that the 9070 is quite good because it trounces the 5070, which, as I made in my conclusion, I even said this, I said, if we remove the XT from the equation and we have a bubble where it's 9070 versus 5070, the 9070 gets our recommendation. But that's hardly a win for the 9070 because the 5070 is a piece of crap. And you wouldn't buy either the 5070 or the 9070. In all scenarios, you would always buy the 9070 XT. So we sort of covered that as our conclusion. So just pitching the 9070 against the 5070 to give the 9070 a win is some weird mental gymnastics, because you have to ignore the fact that the 9070 XT is just much better value and you would just spend $50 and get that every time. So I didn't really see the point of weighing in too heavily on that comparison, because that's not what makes the 9070 make sense.
Yeah, I think it would. You'd discount the 9070 XT relative to the 5070 if the price gap was more like $100.
Yeah.
Like if you had to go from 500 to 600 to buy the 9070 XT, that's what, like 20% more. A lot of people, that's going to be out of their budget range for that card. I think $50 is within the normal budget for people wanting to spend around this amount of money. There's effectively 3 GPU options around the same sort of money, especially when you start considering, what are the prices of a lot of the AIB models. All of that, the general range for all of those cards is very similar.
Yeah,
and so you just can't exclude the XT model.
No, the amount of money though doesn't matter too much. It's the fact that you're when you pay $50 more, you're getting more than that in terms of value. So it's just the better value. It's a better investment. It's a better value product. So it makes no sense to get the discounted part. Obviously, yields are high and stuff, and that's why the 9070 is priced the way it is. I have to imagine, because it makes no sense at that price. I would have My strategy there, if I was in charge of the Radeon group, would be to just launch the 9070 XT and build up inventory of the 9070s where we can either sell them. Well, actually, from a business sense, that doesn't really make sense, does it? Because I imagine all 9070s are sold out anyway. So
Yeah.
I guess from a business sense, you just do it the way you do it. There's still more than half of them are in stock. So I don't have sales figures on the 9070s. I don't know if that strategy's worked out, selling them for only slightly less because, yeah, you shouldn't buy them. But for let's say optics, for brand sort of presence and that mind share thing that NVIDIA has in spades, I would have delayed it either to the point where you could price it at a price point that makes sense relative to the XT, or you can just cash in on all the goodwill of the 9070 XT and then just quietly announce that one later. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that probably would have made more sense. We know from previous GPU launches that the non-XT versions of most models are quite a bit less popular, even if they do make sense.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think back to like RX 5700 versus the 5700 XT, the RX 6800 versus 6800 XT, and then obviously 7900 XT versus XTX, which obviously the pricing there made that card a bit of a dud. But with the previous generations, it's always been the XT model that has been the most popular, even if the lower cards make some sort of sense. So I think if AMD was wanting to launch that model, it only really makes sense as a card when, let's say, you could readily buy a 9070 XT for $600 and they've kind of saturated the market of people interested in buying a Radeon card for $600. So yeah, it's probably going to be a lower margin model, the 9070, sold at the correct price where it makes sense from a performance perspective.
Yeah.
But you'd want to launch that into a position where you're capitalizing on a new market. So if you price it at $500, for example, you'd launch that at some point where anyone buying who wanted to spend $600 on a Radeon card has done so. And so now you want to open yourself up to the people who are willing to spend $500 but not $600. That's when you would go, bang, let's launch the 9070 at the price that actually makes sense for the card. Because yeah, like uses the same die. Yields are pretty good on TSMC N5, so they're probably not getting too many defective dies. I would imagine a significant majority could be made into 9070 XTs, and it has the same VRAM, so they're not saving any money by cutting down VRAM to say 12 gigabytes, which would have saved them, I don't know, $10 or $20 on VRAM cost, right? So it does seem like it's kind of priced based on the cost to manufacture, not the cost that it makes sense. And even then, it could still be potentially a lower margin card. But yeah, that's at least what I would have done, because right now it basically just exists to upsell you into buying an XT. So really, they shouldn't have made very many of them.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm having a look at PC case gear now, and the Reaper and Hellhound, which were both like 1,050, 1,100 Australian dollars, they're sold out. But once you get up to like 1,150, 1,160, 1,200, they're all in stock. So
yeah,
people are pretty well aware of what's going on there, I'd say. And I mean, that is evidence to the scenario you presented earlier where I sort of disagreed and maybe was a bit gung-ho on that one. But it seems like when there's, I don't know, not as much hype around a product and the pricing's a bit, iffy, that they don't really sell out, even in the face of non-availability on everyone else. Because right now, if you want to buy a graphics card from the likes of PC Case Gear, and I imagine they're pretty representative of, well, they're a major online retailer. What have we got? So they've got no 7900 XTs. They've got no 7900 XTXs. They've got a couple of RTX 4070s. They've actually got a couple of 5070s in stock now, which is interesting. And they're not... Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, the 5070s are garbage, though, so that probably makes sense as to why they're in stock.
Yeah, but I just had to look at the price as well.
Yeah, it's
the
bad.
cheapest model is $1,200, which is at $50 more than the cheapest in-stock 9070. So I guess you
Yeah,
can pre-order one for $1,109 if you're willing to wait until the end of the month.
yeah. So at the moment, your options are a 5070 for $1,200
Hmm.
or a 9070 for $1,150.
Yeah,
Pretty
and you can.
obvious which of those you would buy.
And at retail, I just had a look at Scorptech, which is another one of Australia's large retailers. They've got the XFX Quicksilver 9070 non-XD for $1,100. So a little cheaper than the cheapest PC case gear model, but that's in stock as well. Um, so that's further probably why those GeForce models are sort of sitting around for $1,200.
So already we're seeing pretty clear evidence that people aren't tripping over themselves to buy those products at those prices. Which,
Hmm.
if that situation continues for a few weeks, then pricing will filter down because,
Yeah.
well, the GeForce GPUs aren't going to get any cheaper. They are what they are. But I think the Radeon GPUs, will filter down a bit more.
Yeah, they'll approach more the actual converted sort of MSRPs. Pretty
Yeah.
typical for Australia. You'd see it pretty close to like the cheapest listing at PC Case Gear is $1,050 for the 9070, but the actual in stock models are $100 more expensive than that. $50 more expensive at Scorptech. So yeah, that's pretty much the
Well,
situation with those models, right? Like
I think
you
it
want the
clearly,
card to have a good reception at launch,
that's
to
right.
improve that situation.
That's exactly what I was going to say, because you look at 9070 XTs and like
Hmm.
I have no insight into how many of these they got and how many they sold, but I mean there's a 9070 XT Tough Gaming for 1450. There's an Aorus Elite for 1450. There's the Nitro Plus for 1450, and they're all sold out. They were
Yeah.
insta sold out. So the Reaper is $1,140. That's obviously sold out as well. But you go for you go from the Reaper up to like $1,450, but they're all sold out. So 9070 XT met with universally positive reviews, lots of
Hmm.
hype. Almost doesn't seem to matter what the price is on these; they're just all sold out. But the 9070 less so, and you can go buy one right now for
Hmm.
$1,150. You can get a Sapphire model for that price. You can buy a Red Devil for $1,160. So that's a pretty good price for a Red Devil. You can go
Yeah.
buy that right now. Whereas the Red Devil's $1,300 for the XT model. But anyway,
Well, I mean, and even the pricing for the most expensive 9070 XTs is still lower than the MSRP of the 5070 Ti in Australia, and that model just doesn't really exist, really. Like the MSRP for the 5070 Ti in Australia is $1,509, and the 9070 XT's most expensive sold out Nitro Plus or Aorus Elite, $1,450. So that puts it into a pretty, that's not the case in all regions. We did see like 800. I saw $800 models listed for the 9070 XT on Newegg, for example. But at least in Australia, you can sort of see why, like, even someone would be convinced to buy a Nitro Plus because they look at the price. They're like, well, yes, it's not the $1,140 of the Reaper model, but what else am I going to consider? Like, if I wanted this sort of level of performance, the 5070 Ti doesn't even start until $50 more. And what are my chances of buying that? Like, virtually zero.
yeah, that's
So,
right. I mean, if you want the Vanguard RTX 5070, so the 12 gigabyte card, that's $1,400 for the Vanguard. The Tough Gaming's $1,400. So if you want an RTX 5070 Tough Gaming, it's $1,400.
which is
So
just crazy.
the Nitro Plus looks really good. But again, all of this should very, very clearly signal to AMD that they need to get the pricing bang on. They
Yeah.
need to get positive reviews. They need to keep executing the way they have with the 9070 XT.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I think going with the strategy of the 9070 of building up supply of defective dies, releasing it at some point in the future for a good price, I think it wouldn't matter so much if they launched that model and there wasn't enough supply of it. Like, for example, they said, well, we've been collecting defective dies, so we've only got a certain amount of these cards to sell.
mhm.
The 9070 XT is really the normal model. this model is more of a limited supplier. And I think that could still work a bit, so long as they're reasonably transparent with buyers, basically saying, these sort of things like we're not going to be making a ton of these cards. This is for people that want a Radeon card at $500 or whatever. That could work, because on the CPU side, for example, they've done those sorts of, they've released models at cheaper prices, but then they've been somewhat limited in their supply because they're just trying to clear out their defective die inventory. I think that sort of thing could work. And then that could have built a bit of hype for people buying 9070s just to clear out that inventory. Ideally, you'd have both models being widely available at a good prices, make them worth buying. But if they are concerned about things like margins on those cards, then launching it a bit later at a good price, clear them out, continue to make the XT the model that you're focusing on, that could have been a good strategy. So anyway,
well,
they're capitalizing from the XT. So
so what we're going to do is next week we'll have a GPU pricing update. We'll resort the cost per frame data based on typical available retail pricing. We possibly do that for a few different regions, and that'll be that. Really, it's not going to change too many recommendations. Again, right now it really all hinges on availability. For how things really pan out, we're going to have to wait a little bit longer. But again, I can't stress this enough. We're in the inevitable stage right now. PC gaming is a massive industry. They can only make so many of these cards for the gamers all around the world. Back in the day, when PC gaming was nothing like it is now, we still had this exact same problem. I remember doing weekly updates on RX 480 and GTX 1060 pricing and availability. And I think we did like a 5-week series before you could just go buy them at the MSRP. Before then, the pricing was all over the place, as availability was not great. So this has just been par for the course, really. The GeForce situation is unusual. That's not normal. But on the Radeon side of things, we don't know yet. We just don't know. So we'll have to wait and see.
Let's move now to talking about some of the other things I think AMD has done quite well with this launch, which is sort of, it feels like for the first time, Radeon have started to genuinely listen to the feedback from gamers and actually implement these things into their products. So they I don't know whether they were dragged kicking and screaming into listening about the price, but they did at least do some sort of listening on that front. But in addition to that, it feels like with this launch, they've looked at the things that gamers want from a GPU. So the performance, ray tracing performance, upscaling quality, encoding quality, and sort of looking at all those criticisms that they've received in the past for these features. And they've just gone about ticking all those boxes in a way that I don't think we've seen from the Radeon division in the past. It's a lot of the time previously, they've sort of shoved all that stuff under the rug and sort of focused heavily on just the raw performance of the GPU and hoping that that will take care of all the feature deficits that they had in their models. But it feels like with this launch, they've gone about making sure that gamers that are actually interested in buying these products are not going to be let down by things like upscaling. And I was just watching recently the Epos Vox video, I hope that's how you pronounce his channel, on the upscaling quality, not the upscaling quality, the encoding quality of NVIDIA, AMD's new encoding engine. It seems like they've improved that significantly. So they've been able to check off that box with FSR4. My video's out on Hardware Unboxed now. They've kind of checked that box off. Obviously, game support is up in the air, so we'll wait and see how that goes. But it feels like, I don't know, like when AMD said earlier that they were going to change a bit of the strategy of how they've approached the Radeon division, with this launch, it feels like they kind of actually did do that. And it's not just about pricing, but about the overall product that they're delivering. Are you getting that sort of impression as well?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, which is why the reviews have been much better.
Whereas it feels like NVIDIA, on the other hand, the RTX 5070 is kind of the complete opposite. Like, what did they listen to from gamers when making the 5070? They did not listen to concerns about VRAM because they made the exact same VRAM capacity, didn't make any sort of things about pricing or value or anything. It's basically the same model that they already had.
Well,
That's slightly cheaper.
You say this, but they did listen to gamers because it's a totally different situation. AMD were doing a thing we were telling them they shouldn't be doing, and gamers were telling them the same thing by not buying them.
Mhm.
Whereas with NVIDIA, we've been saying we want more VRAM for a long time. It seems like most gamers are on board with that now and have, talking about the VRAM thing. But people are still buying them. So NVIDIA's like, well, this isn't a problem for us. Like, we're giving you 12 gigs and you're buying it and doing so often at inflated prices. So, but having said that, we are seeing the 5070 sales appear very badly. I have to do a bit of research into that, but they're in stock. They're not sold out. I haven't looked at bigger retailers like Newegg, for example, but here in Australia, they're definitely in stock. So this sort of thing catches up with them eventually, right? They can get away with sort of screwing over whatever market segment it is for only so long until either competition comes along and slaps them in the face, or generally that's how it goes, to be fair, or people just do get fed up with it. And I think for a while, the VRAM thing was more edge case kind of stuff. Like when we reviewed the RTX 3070 versus the RX 6800, for example, the 6800 was a more expensive product, twice as much VRAM, and it was very much edge case stuff. And we said at the time, like we said, the 8 gigabytes of VRAM is perfectly fine on the 3070 right now for the overwhelming majority of cases. But are you keeping this thing for 2, 3, 4 years? Because we expect in 2, 3, 4 years it will be a problem, and that's how it played out. But we're still getting the same VRAM amounts on relatively expensive cards, and now it's like 8 gigabytes is woefully insufficient now. I've been demonstrating it for so long, and
and didn't you love that rumors of how all of the models below the 5070, with maybe the exception of the 5060 Ti 16 gig, are all expected to be 8 gig cards? Isn't that going to be great?
Yeah, honestly, I found that hard to believe at the time. Obviously naive on my behalf, but I really thought there was just no way. And we've talked about this at length already, back with like the 5080, with Blackwell being massively underwhelming. And, again, in their defense, without a major architectural overhaul, there's only so much they could do there. But there's also pricing to play with. There's VRAM capacities they could have played with. But look, don't want to dig up past wounds, but when The Last of Us Part 1 came out, to me, it was signaling very clear planned obsolescence. Like, it's just what it looked like to me. I said it, and boy, oh boy, did that shake up the hornet's nest. Like, oh man, we had some NVIDIA fans with their pitchforks out, very, very upset about those comments.
If only all game developers just optimize their games better. It's like, well, I guess you've got to criticize. Maybe you can fairly criticize every single game developer since then. I think I saw lately, and this is a game I haven't tested, I'm not sure how true this is, but Monster Hunter Wilds has a high quality texture pack or something that struggles to run on 16 gig GPUs. I'm not sure about that. But again, like, it's just another.
Well, it's going to struggle to run 8 gigabyte GPUs. You can safely say that. But we've seen that in other games as well. Space Marine 2. There's the, what was it? Forbidden. Which one was it? The Horizon games.
Horizon Forbidden West.
Horizon Forbidden West.
Indiana Jones.
That one's that's a 12 gigabyte killer if you want to use the RTX features. But it's become more and more common, which was kind of the point we were making back when we tested The Last of Us Part 1. And the point wasn't to say, game developers are doing an amazing job or whatever. It's just, it's the game developer problem, the lack of optimization with a lot of games. That's been a thing as far back as I can remember. I honestly don't think it's gotten better or worse. I think it's always been pretty shoddy, especially at release when gamers actually want to play the games. We've talked about this on the podcast before. I used to not be able to benchmark a lot of popular games because you couldn't turn basic features off like VSync.
Yeah, I was going to say, in my opinion, if anything, game optimization has actually gotten better because
If I
you
had,
can
yeah,
you can
yeah.
do things like run above 60 FPS in most games now. You
It,
can use an ultra wide monitor.
it's not a hill I'd want to die on or an argument I'd want to make, but if I had to argue, if I had to pick one option to argue one way or the other, I'd definitely argue that it has improved because I just remember more often than not, we couldn't test new games because there was some very simple feature
Mm-hmm.
that was just broken. Like, yeah, either a hard cap in the game engine, or there was just a bug where you just couldn't turn VSync off. You couldn't force it off in the control panel. Uh, the toggle may have even been in the game. It's just when you put it to off and hit apply, it was like, yep, done, and then it didn't do it. So there was just all kinds of dumb things like that. But yeah, I would say it's been fairly equally bad across time. But again, like the point I was trying to make was with The Last of Us Part 1, well, yeah, it may not have been as optimized as it could have been, and it certainly did improve. If you had like a 6700 XT, which I'm not saying a 6700 XT is a GPU everyone should have bought or is it a particularly amazing GPU, I'm more emphasizing the fact that it had 12 gigabytes of VRAM and it played the game fine on launch. Like you could just play through the game. Other game breaking bugs you will have run into, but it wouldn't have been due to VRAM. And again, like if you're spending, I don't even, what are we even talking about here? Honestly, it's just painful. Like if you're spending $400 US on a GPU, why are you arguing that it's okay that it has 8 gigabytes of VRAM and it's everyone else's fault? How has that become a point of contention or something you argue to defend? It's like, no, that thing should have 12 gigabytes minimum, probably really should have 16 gigabytes. You're getting screwed over and you're actively encouraging them to screw you over. So yeah, I mean the 5070 should be 16 gigabytes minimum. It's just absurd that it doesn't have more VRAM. And again, this problem has become it has continued to become a bigger problem throughout time as these RTX features have actually developed into kind of awesome features, or features that gamers may want to use. Like, again, I'm not big on frame generation, but a lot of people are really excited about it, talk about it. And I know people do want to use it in certain situations. Does require more VRAM.
So does the DLSS4 transformer model. The actual model uses more VRAM than the old model.
Yep. Ray tracing. That uses a lot more VRAM. So you're being, it's an RTX 5070. It's meant to do all the RTX things, but it's a heavily compromised experience for no other reason than the amount of VRAM. And we showed plenty of instances where the 5070 Ti can use stuff like path tracing and frame generation, all that stuff to really deliver a perfectly playable experience at like 1440p with upscaling. But then you use the 5070 and again, for no other reason than the VRAM buffer, it can't do it. So
yeah, I think the
bad.
issue, I think the way that this has played out previously, if we talked about, let's say, 40 series versus RDNA 3, is that NVIDIA offers this compromised experience with VRAM and things like that. And the price isn't great and all that sort of thing. So it's compromised in many different ways. But then you look at what the alternative is from Radeon, and it's compromised too, but just in a whole bunch of other different ways. So whether it's the quality of upscaling or the video encoding or, the supposed driver issues, which, whether or not those are true, I don't think they're particularly true, but there's that perception. So when people are going to buy, let's say, the RTX 4070 versus the 7800 XT, gamers are looking at two compromised experiences and they're picking the GeForce compromised version. They're going, well, I guess I'd rather have DLSS with 12 gigabytes of RAM than FSR with 16 gig or whatever the other benefits AMD are providing, right? So, but that's different this generation. I think that's where NVIDIA's potentially made a bit of a misstep, is that they're offering a compromised experience, 12 gigabytes of VRAM at this absurd price, but then AMD have made a concerted effort to reduce the amount of deficits and compromises for their card. So if you're playing games that support FSR4, for example, upscaling quality is much closer now. You're not going to be as concerned about accessing DLSS. The encoding quality, if you're a game streamer, you're not going to be as concerned about ensuring you have the GeForce card to get that. And it's got more VRAM. And the driver quality, I would say at launch, based on the reports that we're hearing, is clearly better from the Radeon card than the GeForce card, with issues like the black screens and then the whole RUP thing as well, right? Which is not really a driver issue, but there's the risk of getting a compromised card straight out of the box. So the launch is better, right? So I think the misstep and maybe the miscalculation that NVIDIA has made here is that it looks like they were trying to launch this 5070 into a market they were expecting the competition to also have all these compromises. So compromise versus compromise, people are probably going to buy a GeForce card again. But the 9070 XT, when I look at its overall feature package, and I'm trying to think of what are the real compromises in a 9070 XT, it's things like, okay, DLSS isn't supported in as many games. You may be missing out on, multi-frame generation. Potentially you're not going to use that. RTX HDR is something that people talk about. CUDA, which isn't really a gaming thing, right? So I'm thinking about those compromises, and they're just not as many of them now. And so I'm not really concerned about, I guess I have to either put up with medium quality textures on NVIDIA or FSR3, which isn't really that good at 1440p. It's now more like, okay, it's a different scenario. There's one model that's compromised and one model that's not as compromised, in my opinion. Yep. And so that's going to, in a competitive market where people are reading reviews and feedback and actually understanding what the products do, so not as much of the casual audience, which I still expect will buy RTX 5070s in droves, but for our enthusiast audience, I think it's going to be a very different situation in that market, and potentially is going to see 5070s sit on shelves for a lot longer than you'd potentially have expected for a 70 class GPU, which is normally it's kind of like a bread and butter GPU for NVIDIA. Those models sell tons of units, and yet, I don't know, I'm just spitballing stuff here. I don't know how it's going to play. I've got no idea, right? But at least the way I see it's very different.
I agree with what you're saying. For me, it was less about an AMD versus NVIDIA thing, and it was more about just getting NVIDIA GPUs or just GPUs in general with enough VRAM, whether that be from AMD or NVIDIA. I guess I don't want to say mistake, but the catalyst for this was the 3070 versus 6800, because there was 8 gigabytes versus 16 gigabytes. It wasn't necessarily meant to be a buy Radeon GPUs because they're better. It's meant to be, look how much better this GPU could have aged if it had enough VRAM. So
right. Well, I think I was going back to more your talk of like, well, NVIDIA's been reinforced to keep doing that because they keep selling cards. Whereas I'm thinking that potentially this generation, they're not going to get that reinforcement. They're not going to, gamers aren't going to be as keen on going out to buy a card because there's a genuine alternative now, whereas previously that maybe wasn't the case as much.
Yeah, that's definitely it. It's a number of factors, but that's definitely true. Again, go back 2 generations, and there was plenty of 8 gigabyte VRAM defenders. I don't know how they're getting on these days. I imagine it's pretty rough out there. But as time's gone on, more and more people have woken up to the fact that, VRAM capacity is really important. There's still a lot of people that don't understand VRAM and think that, GDDR7 memory bandwidth can compensate for a lack of VRAM, or an increase in L2 cache can make up for it or whatever. So no. The problems that you run into without enough VRAM can only be solved by adding more VRAM. There's unless you're adding sort of like on-die VRAM or some kind of local memory that has the appropriate capacity, there's no way around the VRAM thing. It's a critical component of the graphics card, and when you run out of it, it's very bad. So yeah, I mean, realistically, from my perspective, I was really pushing and advocating for better GeForce GPUs for gamers to get more for their money.
Especially because right, that while you can talk to an enthusiast audience and sort of present a case why you might want to buy a Radeon card, there's kind of an understanding that for people that don't watch Hardware Unboxed, a lot of people just automatically buy the brands that they know, which is NVIDIA GeForce, right? So by you advocating for cards to actually be better, then at least people that don't watch our audience, don't watch our videos, don't aren't as immersed in this, enthusiast experience of PC building and gaming, then at least those people might actually get a better experience and won't just be buying a pre-built at their local Best Buy or JB Hi-Fi here in Australia or whatever, and then being like, why can't I play X game at the highest settings when I spend all that money? Like, why is that not possible? So obviously advocating for these things is good and benefits lots of people, especially when it comes to cards that you just know are going to be highly sold in just tons and tons of units in those sorts of casual pre-built sort of things. Laptops as well. The VRAM situation on laptops is even worse. Like, I think they released like 4 gig models not that long ago, which is just like disgusting.
And there's really no reason for that either. Like, it's just, But I mean, laptop gaming, you're getting actively screwed multiple different ways. But again, like with the RTX 3070, nothing would make me happier than for that to have been a 16 gigabyte model. Like I want that to have 16 gigabytes of VRAM, not 8, because it would still be highly usable today. And you wouldn't be constantly worrying about what texture setting you have. Is that crippling your performance and stuff like that? And again, you don't want to pay $400-500 US for a GPU and then 10 minutes later be worrying about, with this new game, I have to play around the texture slider because that's what's resulting in stuttery performance or crippling frame rates, and just becomes a pain in the backside. You want to just be able to max out and not have to worry about it. Again, especially at those price points. If you're paying $200, then sure, compromised experience there. But at the dollar value at which you should be like, look, you've bought the wrong GPU, you're a peasant, you've got the compromised experience, suck it up, stop complaining, go away. That was like $70, and then it got to like $150, and now, where are we at now? It's like $600 on the GeForce side. I mean, realistically, it's $750 now, isn't it? You've got to spend $750 for sort of the minimum spec RTX experience, and if you go below that, you're getting really a heavily. I don't think it's crazy to say or unreasonable to say that you're getting a heavily compromised RTX experience when you go below 750. We're talking about MSRP prices here. 12 gigabytes of VRAM, it ain't it, and it's not enough. You can argue about it all you want now, but we're not just thinking about the here and now, even though there are problems in the here and now. But if you're spending $550 on a GPU, you're going to keep it for more than 6 months. Realistically, like if you're honest and realistic, that's I would say a minimum of a 3-year investment, because realistically, you're not getting a replacement GPU anyway for at least another 2 years. So
yeah, that's right. You'll probably be waiting for like the 60 series Super before you would consider it.
I would say realistically, the majority of people would hold on to that purchase for 4 years, 3 at a minimum. Let's see what games are like in 3 years.
Yep.
And I also I find it mind-numbing, the whole argument of, but games don't need to use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM or more than 12 gigabytes. How did we get to the point in time where VRAM requirements no longer need to be expanded upon? Where are we going to be in 20 years? I find that weird. That it's a weird argument, isn't it? Like,
oh yeah, it's just fanboy crap arguments. Like it makes no sense. I think the only way you could justify these low VRAM capacities at high prices is if you make it clear that the card is some sort of like esports model. Like again, you have to make 2 models, so it doesn't work as it's a lone model. But for example, with like the upcoming 5060 Ti or whatever, where it's rumored to have a 16 and 8 gig card, I think unlike with the 4060 Ti where the focus was on the 8 gig card and then the 16 gig card was like, oh yeah, we're kind of doing that too. The focus has to be on the 16 gig model. That's the normal model, priced normally, so that it's not ridiculously expensive. And then you make a slightly cheaper 8 gig card and be like, well, if you only play Fortnite or whatever, then just get that. But for most people, we want you to buy the 16 gig card.
And the strategy doesn't work. The house of cards comes crumbling down. They show their hand on that one because it doesn't cost that much to clamshell these cards and add that. Remember It's $100, guys. It's
Right. Yeah.
$100. There's technical reasons you don't understand, the traces, it's all really
Yeah.
complicated stuff
We
above your
have
pay
to put
grade.
$1 of copper on the PCB at the factory, and that equals $100 more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, Nvidia told us to our faces that can't be done. It's more expensive than we understand. And how long was it? How long was it till that margin was slashed exactly in half? Matter of
Yeah.
months. Like, matter of months. It went from being an absolute impossibility, just out of the question, guys, cannot be done. And
Oh,
it's like,
clamshell design. How innovative is that? We've never used that before. The GPU manufacturers will never have any clue how to do that, so they'll have to do all this research and development. It's like, yeah, come on, guys.
so with the 5060 Ti, they already know. If they charge $100 more for the 16 gigabyte version, which is the version everyone knows they want and need realistically, they get laughed out of the room, and then they have to discount that part to the point where the 8 gigabyte card no longer sells.
That's why I think the 8 gig card has to be some sort of like limited edition like not a high volume model. It's the model where.
But even if you're doing esports, you're not going to save $50 to buy that card.
Yeah, I guess so.
You're just not doing it. It doesn't make sense. Because again, even in esports, if there's guys that play predominantly esport games, but maybe they'll stream like a new horror game or something for a bit, or they'll just play another game to relax and unwind on the side, and they want to enjoy that to the best of their ability.
You have to be a single game gamer, don't you? You have to like never consider playing those other things.
But even then, for $50 just to get the extra VRAM, it's just because you don't know what the future holds again. It's such a small amount of money that it just doesn't make sense to save the $50 and get 8 gigabytes of VRAM in 2025 on your graphics card. That's just wild. So for it to make sense, they have to make the 8 gigabyte card considerably cheaper than they want to. So again, there's that. So they need to price the 16 gigabyte 5060 Ti at a price point where it's competitive, where it needs to be. So let's say it's $400. That's where it needs to be though, right?
Oh yeah, I'm assuming so. I don't know what the specs are, but I'm just assuming it probably will need to be about that. But I'm just laughing because there's absolutely no way it will be $400 for the 16 gig model.
The 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte. I'm gonna leak this information right now on the Harbour Box podcast. It's going to be ever so slightly faster than like a 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte. So you heard it here first.
That's video cards. Get on it. There's an article for you.
Yeah, there's a crazy leak for you. It's basically going to be the same product again. So, but my point is, regardless of what the price is, let's not trip up on the price here. Whatever the price is, the 8 gigabyte version needs to be much cheaper, and they need to price the 16 gigabyte model where it makes sense. So. So basically, you're giving the esports model makes sense if it's $100 cheaper or whatever at those price points. Anyway, really shouldn't exist. 8 gigabyte graphics cards should be your most entry level. There's almost no point making a discrete. It's like making a 4 gigabyte GPU now. Like remember what was it, the 6500 XT? Oh, you can't even load that into most games now because of the VRAM. I mean, there is an 8 gigabyte model, which is a lot better, but that's again clamshelled. Anyway, 8 gigabyte graphics cards really shouldn't exist anymore. That's the situation we've gotten to in 2025. Outside of like the most, your 3050 type class product, but again, like a 5050 product. That's a funny name for a start. What's that going to cost him?
I mean, I can't see it costing less than $250.
No, it's probably going to be a $300 product. Do you want to pay $300 for 8 gigabytes of VRAM in 2025?
No. Yeah, I mean, this is a great opportunity for AMD to just make sure that the RX 9060 XT or whatever is a
Might
16
be a
gig model.
9050, but yeah.
No, I think that, if they can make a 9060 XT, it's probably going to be a 5060 competitor, then a non-XT model is maybe a 5050 competitor. Easy win, just make both models 16 gig. The easiest win that AMD will ever have is competing is directly competing a 16 gig model against an 8 gig model in the same sort of price class?
I mean, it's GDDR6 for a start, so it shouldn't be that difficult or crazy to do. And the memory performance here is almost irrelevant on these lower end GPUs. You go back to GDDR5 and it would work fine. It's the capacity that's key. Because again, when you exceed the capacity, for those of you who don't know, that you have to go out to system memory. And what that entails is going through the PCIe bus to the CPU, which is definitely the bottleneck. You could be reduced to like 16 gigabytes of bandwidth, depending on the PCIe configuration of the graphics card. But the bandwidth /2, pretty much the PCIe bus speed. You go out to the CPU, through the CPU's memory controller, out to the system memory, and then back. And the other big problem that causes is it significantly increases latency. So latency is a massive component here for stuff like frame time performance. And that is the reason why the high speed GDDR memory is placed right next to the GPU die. So you get that high bandwidth, low latency. When you go out to system memory, you get low bandwidth, high latency. So you want to avoid that at all costs. So even if you have, because I think even like, what does a 4060 have for memory bandwidth? It's got to be like 200-ish, 270, something like that, gigabytes per second.
4060 has 272 gigabytes per second.
Yep. So if you're going from 270 down to like 16, that's bad. So they could afford on an entry level card to have memory that only facilitates around 200 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. It's not going to be the world's most high-end graphics card, but at no point are you going from having around 200 gigabytes per second of bandwidth to 16 with high latency, which is why you get insane frame stuttering and just, I mean, we've demonstrated it countless times on the channel now. So if you want to see what it looks like, just go look at one of our VRAM related videos and you'll get that. But anyway,
I mean, the 5070 was a fail, not just because of its VRAM though. It also had a terrible performance uplift in that class. So I think the reason why we're seeing, again, the slow sales, places like, or at least they don't know whether we're slow sales, but at least you can go buy one right now, PC Case as of filming this video, is because it's just a 4070 Super. There's nothing exciting about it. So it's not only has inadequate VRAM and is not very competitive against the Radeon cards, it just isn't an exciting product. Like no one's like, oh, wow, I really waited all this time to get a newer version of the 4070 Super for a slightly lower price. That's just a card that there's no excitement around that at all.
Yeah, I disagree though. If it had 16 gigabytes of VRAM, it's sold out. Because 4070 Supers are basically sold out at $1,200. And these are coming in at $1,200. So you would be getting a 4070 Super with the biggest issue with the 4070 Super solved. I'm telling there's no way of proving this.
Right.
but I am extremely confident if the 5070 at 1,200 Australian dollars had a 16 gigabyte VRAM buffer, it would be sold out.
I was more thinking of like, because it has 12 gigabytes, there's also nothing else going for it. If it was a much faster 12 gigabyte card, then maybe people would have been interested in it.
It's sort of one or the other. Yeah. There's got to be something there. And
they remade the 4070 Super and made the it's actually a little wild to me that they even bothered to make this a new GPU. Like I know Blackwell has some enhancements to various different things that allows multi-frame gen, it's got a new display engine, whatever, okay? But like you put in all that effort to make a new GPU and what you get out at the end is the same thing that you already had. Seems kind of pointless to me.
Yeah, I think it'll age a little bit better because we have seen in the more memory bandwidth situations, it can be the 4070 Ti Super or slightly better. I'm not saying that saves the product in any stretch of the imagination, but if it had 16 gigabytes of VRAM, that solves that, and then it ends up aging better as well because of the significant memory bandwidth improvement. Anyway, it's neither here. It's neither of those things. So
it's a slightly smaller die, so I guess they went from the 295 square millimeters 8104 to 263 square millimeters GB205. It's a slightly smaller die, but then 8104 was used for the RTX 4070 Ti, which is faster than the 5070. So the extra die size, no, shocker, it actually made the product perform better. So again, it's almost one of those situations where NVIDIA could have just like basically re-released the same model, like done RX 480 to RX 580, which is basically the same GPU. They could have just done that. I mean, I guess there's some other benefits. As you said, it might age better because of the G7 memory. But outside of that, it's just such an underwhelming uplift. Like normally we see at least something from the 5070. And again, that's why NVIDIA got on stage and told everyone it was a 4090. Is because there's nothing else. There's literally nothing else about the product to get excited about. So they have to make up something to get people interested.
Yeah, it made it even worse.
Well, yeah, because then you have to talk about the marketing lies and stuff in your video. So yeah, just a mess. So
yeah,
I guess that does it. Let's take a break and we'll come back and talk about our boring lives. All right, Steve, what's been happening over at your place?
Not a lot, as you know, but I do have a boring life story, so that's good. So I've saved the podcast on my end anyway, because it's been a struggle for me. Obviously, last week 2 embargoed GPU releases, but 3 GPUs, so essentially three reviews. Yeah. So I've been flat out, and now I've got the new CPU to deal with. But I got to the end of the week and I thought, you know what, I'm taking the day off today. I've got this CPU system, all that stuff sitting there waiting for me. I'm not going to dive straight into it. I'm just going to take a breather and relax. So to relax, I ended up getting covered in grease. So that was fun. I have a mini skid steer. So in Australia, they're typically called like dingoes. But I think in the US, most people know what a skid steer is. And it's like one of the mini ones, you stand on the back of it. And so I have quite a large property. Well, it's 5-acre property. So it's reasonably large for, a residential property. And we do a lot of gardening and things and construction. So I ended up acquiring one of these. It's a very good machine. My one is a McLaughlin Ranger. Now, unfortunately, shortly after I bought it, the McLaughlin company went out of business. So that was unfortunate timing. But the machine is very good, very robust. It's an absolute beast. And it came highly recommended from some professionals. So anyway, got that machine. I've had it for 2 years now. It's worked a treat. And, I've generally... I've paid someone else to service it to date. And now this can be sort of difficult to explain, but basically it had an engine oil leak. Now it's got a Kohler engine. It's a 22.5 horsepower engine. Now the engine itself is perfectly fine. As I said, it's only 2 years old and hasn't seen that much use. Now the dealer that sold them added their own modifications to make it easier to service them. So getting to the sump plug is reasonably difficult on these machines. So to make it easier, they put in an elbow with like a hose that comes out, and then you can just crack the nut on the hose, drain the oil, change the oil filter, put the nut back in, fill it up with oil, and away you go. It's all quite quick and simple. And so the guy that serviced the machine a year ago did exactly that. It all went smoothly. Machine was great. These things tend to leak a little bit of hydraulic oil and stuff, which isn't a problem. But I noticed it was leaking a bit of oil, and it didn't seem like hydraulic oil. Anyway, one day I went to start it, and I could hear the big end bearing for a few seconds until it got up to oil pressure. So I was like, oh, we're a little bit low on oil. That's not good. So I topped up the oil. That solved that. And then I noticed about 2 weeks later, it had lost oil again. So I'm like, why the hell? No, or I realized it's this. So this 90-degree angular connector they've put straight into the sump, like swivels a bit. It's like one of those swivel type connectors. But the thread that you screw in to the engine had come loose. Now, the problem with that is I had 2 mechanics come out because I didn't want to deal with it. So I got 2 mechanics to come out and look at it, and they were both like, yeah, that's a too hard basket. Like, I might be able to do it, but, So anyway, I got 2 guys to look at. They weren't super keen. I had this day. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to go fix this thing myself. And so I thought, you know what I'll do? I'm just going to cut this stupid 90-degree connector off with like a reciprocating saw, doing it so I don't heat it up too much to catch things on fire. um, but I'll cut this connector off, and then I'll be able to put a socket over it, undo it, just throw that thing away, and just use the regular sump plug. Sounds simple enough, right?
Yep.
So I cut the connector off and drain the remaining oil out of the engine. That all goes to plan, exactly as expected. And then I go to put a socket over it, and I just can't fit the socket on it. I'm like, what the hell? Why can't I get the socket on there? And then I realize the fitting is touching the engine mount plate, so the socket can't go over it. So you got like a hex head, and I can get over part of it, but not the bottom because it's hitting the plate. So I'm like, oh, that's annoying. I'll have to use an adjustable shifter or a spanner. So I get the spanner on there, and like this is very difficult to access. So I'm just getting my hand down the side between like the metal plate and the engine and all that. You're talking about 2 inches probably of room to work in. So you can get like a ratchet down there, no worries, but getting the spanner is quite difficult. Anyway, I got the spanner on there, and I just could not turn this thing at all. Like it was loose like it's loose, which is why it's dripping oil, but I can't turn it. And then I've realized it's sitting so close to the plate where I can't get the socket on it that's actually just touching the plate. So one side of the hex head is just resting flush with the plate, so you can't turn it. You sort of follow what I'm saying? So the solution to that was I had to take the whole engine out. So I had to disconnect the hydraulic lines, disconnect the battery, disconnect the air intake, disconnect the exhaust. Not a big deal really, but it took me probably an hour and a half to get all that crap off it. And then this engine, which I can pick up by myself, it's just a small horse engine like what would be on your lawnmower, for example. So I've picked it up, rotated it, and then underneath it, it's on this 12 mil thick steel plate, because everything on this thing's made to be overkill because it's like a 900 kilogram machine. They want to make the back of it as heavy as possible, the counterweight.
Yeah.
And so this 12 mil thick plate that sits under the engine sits on top of it, and the sump nut touches it, so you can't turn it, which the dealer was obviously aware of. So they've probably got in like 50 of these machines and done this procedure where they've put this angle on it so that the owner doesn't have to deal with it unless it becomes loose, and then they have to take the engine out to tighten it. And I didn't want to have to deal with that ever again. So I decided this huge engine mount plate was overkill. Like you could put a 500 horsepower engine on it. Like it was that thick, the steel. It's thicker than what you get in a car. So I ended up having to get my plasma cutter and cut out just about the size of a 50-cent coin. I don't know. What's a comparable dimension for our US viewers? I don't know.
A large coin.
Yeah, a large coin. So I had to cut out a square shape about the size of a large coin under where the sump plug goes, with my plasma cutter, because it's 12 mil thick steel. So yeah, good luck cutting that thing. Grind. It's going to take way too long. So dropped that out, cleaned up the cut, primed it, painted it, protected it. Then I reinstalled that bracket to the bottom of the engine, rebuilt the entire thing, and now all I have to do is stick a nut in the end of the socket on a ratchet and just pop it in. It's like you can get it in and out now in under a minute. The problem is there's no actual way to really drain the oil without it creating a huge mess. So I have to park the machine on my hill on an angle, pop the nut, and then it runs down. I have to have a bucket under the counterweight, and it just all pours off the counterweight, which is, fine. It's better than engine outing every single time I have to do an oil change. So anyway, I gave the thing a full service while I was there. Now it runs great. It sounds amazing, really smooth. So that's all good. But yeah, so I went down and I'm like, you know what? I'll just tackle this. How long could it be? And then, my wife comes down, the engine's off the machine. The whole thing's, 90% disassembled. And she's like, oh, I'll just leave you to that. Walks away. So
it's back together and working?
Back together, runs runs really well. Sounds great. Perfect. So once it blew off a bit of smoke from the oil and stuff that was sort of left, I degreased it as much as I could, but it had been leaking oil for like a month. And I just had to keep topping it up because it was only a very slow leak when it was active, because it was leaking through the thread. Essentially, the thread needed to be tightened.
Yep.
So I had to go buy a sump plug and everything for it, because the contraption that was attached to it didn't have a sump plug that could go straight into the sump. So anyway, that was so I ended up, because I wasn't planning on doing it. When you don't plan on doing something, so you weren't prepared as, so I didn't have like my mechanic gloves and stuff. I just went in it. So I was smashing my knuckles and everything. So now when I make a fist, it's still very uncomfortable, but minor issue. But on my relaxing day off, that's what I did. I played mechanic it probably took me about 2.5 hours all up, maybe 3 hours.
Well, that's not too bad.
Yeah, not too bad. I would have rather put my feet up and sip a drink for a couple of hours and watch my day go by. But no, it was productive, and to be fair, I was very, very happy once it was all put together and running well. So bit of sense of achievement there, and stoked
nice.
that I know more about the machine now than I ever wanted to, but at the same time, it's kind of handy now, because if anything goes wrong, I know exactly what's what. So it's got like, the hydraulic pump is bolted directly to the engine, so it's like one big unit, which does make it very easy to work on. Anyway, that's my boring life stuff. I've got no updates on Balin's car. He still doesn't have it back. The Hardware Unbox gym build is going well. I'll probably do like a BTS update in Discord for the guys on that. But obviously the last few weeks it's been difficult, but I'm hoping soon I'll have a bit of free time, but it doesn't sound like it, does it? So I think it'll just be business as usual.
Yeah. Yeah. Out this way, the most recent thing that I've done that's even remotely interesting, because most stuff is not interesting at all, really.
Well, it's got to be boring life stuff. It can't be interesting.
Well, I've almost finished mulching up all my trees. I've got one more tree to go that has been fallen, so I'll put that through the mulcher pretty soon. But that's not what I was going to talk about. What has been happening out this way is I almost ran out of storage on my storage server.
Oh.
So I have a 110 terabyte storage server, and amazingly, don't know how this happens, eventually it fills up. You'd think 110 terabytes would be more than enough. Turns out, no, that's actually not the case. So luckily, because I use Unraid as my storage server, it's quite easy to add additional storage to Unraid, which is one of the main reasons why I went with Unraid over other solutions. Obviously, some people like TrueNAS and all those sorts of things. I went with Unraid because it's very easy to add in new storage. The problem, though, with my storage server is that I didn't actually have enough drive bays to put in. So I just used like a large desktop computer case, not a server thing, mainly because it's in my office. And so I don't want to have to deal with like loud, annoying, high-pressure server fans. So with the desktop case, the drives are spaced a little larger, so you can run cooling over the drives at a sort of lower speed. So basically, you don't need to run these ridiculously loud and annoying fans to cool your drives so that they don't die prematurely. So that's why I've been using that case. But anyway, I'd used, I think, 14 drives in there, and I wanted to add in another 3. So I was like, what am I going to do there? And it turns out I had left over like I actually had 2 of these like 4 drive bay things from my previous storage server before I moved to the new one. I was like, I reckon I can jerry rig this inside the rest of the case, just floating around in there. So that's what I ended up doing, basically. This drive sort of 4-bay thing happened to have quite a number of useful mounting points on it. So at the top of my server, instead of having a radiator, I basically just attached this drive bay up there and ended up working really well. So I added an extra, I think, 50 terabytes of storage in there with a couple of those nice big 18 terabyte drives. And now I've got plenty of space. So that should be enough for at least another couple of years worth of Hardware Unbox videos. And to be fair, I could also, I've got some like 8 terabyte drives in there that I could swap out for 18 terabyte versions. But whenever you're buying a new drive, it's kind of like, well, if I could use all 18 terabytes, that's like good value. Like I use all of what I've paid for. If I swap out an 8 for an 18, I'm basically paying 18 terabytes, but only getting 10. So I thought, unless I physically run out of space, like in the case, like I cannot put more drives in there in any space, and so I have to build another server, I'll just try continue adding drives. So I've been able to do that at least up until, I think, beyond, now that there's 16 drives in there instead of the 13. I think I had 13, not 14 previous. Anyway, now that I've got 16 drives, I've actually now run out of SATA ports. So now I'll have to add in an extra, one of those PCIe cards, those sorts of things. So it's always a work in progress, but with Unraid, super easy to add in extra drives, works really well. You got to wait like a couple of days for it to do the pre-clearance stuff. But once that's done, added in, no problems. Drive's got like 60 terabytes of space now, so that should last me at least I'd be hoping for at least 3 or 4 more years out of that, because I make about 10 terabytes of stuff for Hardware Unboxed a year. So anyway, storage server fun times. But yeah, it's always fun to get in there and sort of think about, how did I set this up originally? So how can I like actually add in stuff to it? Look in there, there's not enough drive space. There wasn't enough power space either on the PSU, but luckily those drive bays they were using PCIe 6-pin connectors instead of the SATA connectors for each of the drives. So you basically just plug in one PCIe connector to the back plane, and then it just powers the 4 drives directly that way. So that solved that problem as well. So it's going well, but maybe I'll have to add in a second storage server at some point, make a second version. So anyway, that's my situation out this way. So
Nice.
Nothing else has really been happening, to be fair. I've just been busy at work like you for the past month or so on all those GPU comparison videos. So taking a bit easier for the next couple of weeks, so I think. So I'll be able to do a few more interesting and exciting things. Plus this week's weather is supposed to be pretty warm every day, so that should be nice. So
yeah, well, I'm going to the F1 on the weekend, so I'll post some BTS action on that. So I'm excited about that. That'll be good.
Cool.
I'm going on Friday as well, so I'll start posting stuff on Friday.
Nice.
For the free practices and whatnot. So that should be good. So
cool.
I should have. Well, we'll probably. I don't know when will we film the next podcast, Tim?
I don't know. After that, it's probably not going to be that much to talk about, so we'll just slot that in somewhere it makes sense.
Yeah, that sounds good. Cool.
Well, that pretty much does it for this week's episode. Again, a mega episode because we had a lot to talk about, but obviously 3 GPUs in 1 week, you're probably going to have to make a long podcast to talk about it. So thanks to everyone that's listened to the end of this episode. If you want to listen to ad-free versions of our podcast, we do have the supporter feed that you get if you become a Patreon member. So links to that will be in the description. There's also a few bonus episodes, stuff like our live streams and Q&As go into there as well. So yeah, we'll have fun with that if you're interested on the Patreon. What else? Just we're available on all the usual places, so check us out there. But until next week or next time we get around to doing a podcast, thanks for listening to the end of this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.